Yep. And we are going live in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Go ahead, Debbie.
Good evening. I'm Nassau County Legislator Debra Mulé, and I represent the 5th District in Nassau County, which is basically areas of the South Shore of Nassau County. It is my great honor to be presenting this wonderful event that we're having tonight, so we can all learn more about Juneteenth. We have with us Dr. Shabazz and Dr. Miletsky. I have only the most basic understanding of what Juneteenth is, and I'm going to be very honest, I didn't know anything about it as of just a couple of years ago. So I think that this is something that all of us need to know more about. I was so happy when it was named an official holiday in the state of New York. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing about what our panelists have to say. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Jonathan, okay?
All right. Thank you so much, Legislator Mulé. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jonathan Priebos. I am the Chief of Staff for Legislator Debra Mulé, and we have two very esteemed guests assisting us in tonight's program. From Stony Brook University, we have Dr. Miletsky, as Legislator Mulé said, and from Nassau Community College, we have Dr. Shabazz. So, gentlemen, as you guys know, this week there's a lot of celebrations going on in honor of Juneteenth that is forthcoming this weekend. So I'm just going to dive right into our questions. So for those unfamiliar with Juneteenth, can you share some details about its origins for those who are unfamiliar?
Yeah, I can. I'd be glad to defer to my esteemed colleague, my brother, my elder today, with Dr. Shabazz. And I greet you, sir. Salutations. We know that. Well, you know what? I'm going to ask Dr. Shabazz.
Dr. Miletsky, you're a little low. Can you?
Oh, okay. Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're better now.
Okay.
Did you open it up for me?
Yes.
You gave me the opening?
Yeah.
You passed it to me, right?
Yep. It's all on you.
All right. Greetings, everyone. Yeah, man. Most honored to be asked to be on this panel, and panelists that we have, and Dr. Miletsky, as well as the Honorable Debra Mulé, the legislator. Talking about Juneteenth, to talk about and to talk about the Civil War is to
Dr. Shabazz, I apologize. We seem to have a little bit of delay. Can you hear us okay?
Not really over the directly over the topic of slavery or the freedom of slavery. Can you hear me all right? I'm sorry.
Yeah, we're good. We're good now. We're good. I apologize. Go ahead.
Yeah. Originally, the Civil War was fought to maintain the Union and to keep the South from seceding from the Union. And the reason that the South wanted to secede from the Union, had to do with its desire to create more and more strength as new states were entered into the Union, to encourage them to be slave states, to support the institution of slavery, of course. And the northern states were not comfortable with the expansion of slavery because with the empowerment, the economic empowerment of southern, the new states that were coming in, whether they would be slave states or free states, the debate was to break down and in the breakdown of the debate, the Confederate, I like to call.
Oh, he's muted.
Oh, let me see here.
For a moment. I lost you for a moment. It's because it's probably because I was going to use a bad metaphor. I was going to use a bad metaphor. You know, I was going to talk about the institution of slavery. And, you know, this is a mature, I don't think there's no rating on this thing. So I'll call it what I usually call it in class. The shitstorm of slavery was the main issue in terms of the expansion of the South and their desire. And so, you know, when the Southern states determined that they no longer needed the industries where the raw materials were being shipped in the North, you know, that's the whole way that the economics of the union of slavery was to operate. The raw materials that were produced in the South, whether it be rice, tobacco, cotton, sugar, manufacture these into products and get their payoff from the institution of slavery. But the more and more that the South had a different political desire in the South to decide their own economic and political destiny, to create their own industries and not to rely on shipping their materials to the North, that they could create their own industries and their own trades internationally. They decided that that would be their option. And for that was the real reason for their succession. And Lincoln at first didn't make slavery and the freedom of Africans at all at the beginning of the Civil War. The freedom of Africans was not at all a topic in the Civil War rationale. That the freedom of Africans became necessary when the northern states, when the Union, you know, could not really amass the strength to overcome the Confederate states. That the Union and the white soldiers of the Union, who are soldiers of course, are never part of the elite class. They're always, you know, part of the common man. And likewise, most of the white soldiers that were fighting in the Union cause, they didn't have a passionate reason, you know, in fighting the war, like many of the Africans or the African quote unquote Americans, the Africans in the northern states that had escaped from slavery. They had a passionate reason to join the Union and to fight in the Union cause. At first, you know, free Blacks that were in the North, their services were welcomed by the Union forces, but not really as soldiers, not to carry guns and not to kill Confederates, but just to work as a support staff to soldiers at that time. But it wasn't until you know the Union and Lincoln was to recognize that the tide was not turning in the success or for the success of the Union, and with great lobbying that came from free African quote unquote Americans like Frederick Douglass and Martin Delany, as well as others, Sojourner Truth, as well as others that petitioned Lincoln in terms of the Civil War cause. Scratch Sojourner Truth, I might be adding too much, but definitely Frederick Douglass and Martin Delany. These were two Black abolitionists that spoke to Lincoln and very much encouraged him to allow Black troops to fight. And once Black troops were able to fight, the tide was well turned. The tide was well turned. Over 250,000 African quote unquote Americans were enlisted and fought in the Union cause. 250,000 African Americans. I don't know. Take the LA Coliseum and fill it up 2 times. 250,000 African Americans fought that Union cause. 38,000 African Americans transitioned to the ancestral realm and gave their cause for the freedom of their brothers, their sisters, their mothers, their fathers, their daughters, their loved ones that were enslaved by the wicked institution of slavery, operated, created, perpetrated by the U.S. government, and yeah, and so Juneteenth comes into context, 1863. Should I continue, Dr. Miletsky? 1863.
Go ahead, my brother.
1863, you know, during this time, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. And in 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was a very virtuous and symbolic document. But in terms of real weight, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't free any Africans that were really enslaved. All of the Africans that were enslaved were in the Confederate States. The Confederacy had seceded from the Union at that time, and so they were not listening to Lincoln's orders, and they didn't free any Africans. The Confederate States, as I researched, as you did as well, Dr. Miletsky, in preparation, you know, I found Lerone Bennett's chronology in his index, in his appendix, very useful. He says that Lincoln, when he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, it freed slaves in the rebel states, but it did not apply to slaves in the border states like Maryland and Virginia. You know, and when I say Maryland, oftentimes when I teach students, you know, they think that Maryland is in the north today, but you know, during the time of slavery, it was up south, and you know, it was from Maryland that Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman were actually to escape from slavery and find freedom in Philadelphia, and then further up in New York. But in 1863, when this document was signed, you know, it created this passionate fervor of African Americans to participate in the war effort. And it was with the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation that Blacks were allowed to pick up arms and actually fight the Confederacy and give more than a supportive role. And then, as the history shows us, in less than 2 years' time, with the African, quote unquote, American participation as the Buffalo Soldiers of the Union Army, you know, they were able to defeat the Confederacy, and in 1865, in January of 1865, the 13th Amendment of the Constitution was signed, and the 13th Amendment of the Constitution by Lincoln was the amendment of the Constitution that freed Africans from slavery. And so, you know, as of January of 1865, in the Union, and the Union was totally won in January of 1865, or in 1865, I should say, that the Civil War officially ends with Robert E. Lee surrendering at Appomattox, Virginia, in 1865, and when we're talking about Juneteenth, it would not be until June of 1865 that the Union Army would reach Texas and liberate Texas, and the Africans that were enslaved in Texas, their slave holders, their quote unquote slave masters, yeah, they didn't reveal to them that they were freed, and it wasn't until 1865 in June 19th, hence the Juneteenth celebration. It wasn't until June 19th, 1865, when General Gordon Granger of the Union Army, he marched troops into Galveston, or into Texas, and eventually in Galveston, Texas, it was heard that Africans were freed from enslavement of white slave masters and the U.S. Confederate government at that time. And just as a last note, if I didn't mention it, just to mention it once more in my note taking, you know, it was the 62nd U.S. Black Division of Troops, which fought the last Civil War battle, and that was to take place in White Ranch, Texas. I guess that name is appropriate. The last Civil War battle was fought in White Ranch, Texas, in 1865. And now I used to run track, so I'm ready to pass the baton on to Dr. Miletsky.
Yes. Thank you,
One
sir.
love, respect.
One love, respect. Thank you. I knew there was a reason. Someone told me I'm gonna let Doc go first, and you can hear. I think we all heard right there. You know, beautiful summation. He gave it to you from the beginning in the arc and to where it goes, and I just kind of maybe fill in some extra things. Was right, correct. With, you know, Dr. Shabazz was saying this sort of like back and forth of the admission of free state, slave state, free, maybe 2 free states, 2 more slave states, 3, you know, and goes on like that basically from more or less from the formation of the republic, you know, in 1789 up to all through those years of the 19th century. This system, our American political system, which we know is based upon compromise, based on a system of checks and balances. And that system was being pushed to its limits, and yet the genius or the interesting part of that system was working in the sense that it kind of kept this balance of power between the North and the South. A lot of people don't realize, because we tend to think about, you know, the Northern Revolution, Northern, you know, Industrial Revolution, that kind of thing. For most of America's history, or a good part of it, at least half of it, the South was the place that was the richest part. You know, because of slavery, because of the incredible head start and shortcut known as exploitative labor, in this case, free labor, which gives you a heck of a advantage over any other place that you're in competition with, as one can imagine. One of the reasons that, you know, America's, you know, I hope y'all can still hear me, youngest, you know, countries, people say, and also people say, the richest country in the world. Well, but did so in the shortest amount of time on record in the history of the world. No other empire or no other major global power has built so fast. And so common sense tells us, how did that happen? You know, how did we get to that point? And so the South had been the concentration of wealth, very hesitant to give up that advantage. They put into the U.S. Constitution something called the 3/5 Compromise. And the 3/5 Compromise had to do with basically the ability to count the slave population as the voting population, so as not to lose representation in Congress, because slave folks were not counted as citizens. But some of these southern states are Black majorities. So we hear some of the rhetoric that comes out of the South is sort of one of victimization a lot of times, that this is going to be unfair to us. This is going to be, North will have the upper hand and we'll be left with nothing. So they came up with this idea, if we can count the enslaved who we've dragged here in chains to do our labor and to build our country, can we also count them as, you know, part of the voting public, so that we don't lose representation in Congress? Remember, every state has 2 senators, from tiny Rhode Island or Vermont to Texas, or it doesn't matter the size. But when it comes to the House of Representatives, that is counted by how many population there is. So by counting the enslaved, this is the ultimate insult and salt in the wound, if you will, in addition to all the terrible things that we know, and Dr. Shabazz really broke it down for us, all the terrible things that we know that happened during slavery, the things we see in the movies, the separation of families, the mutilation of bodies, and the terrible things that we know that happened in slavery that go on and on. On top of that, the audacity to then count them is so that kept the South in the game for a while, population-wise. So they didn't lose the representatives in Congress on that basis. And a lot of people say, "But the most important thing is you're only counting black people as 3/5 of a human being, in addition to all the other things." So slight after slight after slight. These are more than slights. Maine becomes a state, which was always was actually part of Massachusetts. A little old Maine becomes a state so that Missouri can come in as a slave state, the Missouri Compromise. So you've heard this in our language, compromise after compromise after Missouri Compromise, all of these sort of compromises as the country is growing from sea to shining sea. Remember, the 13 colonies were just along the eastern seaboard. As land and territories is coming into the picture with expansion, the Louisiana Purchase, which is not just the state of Louisiana, it's like this big swath of land, the country basically. Past the Mississippi, adding to its wealth in terms of Texas. I'm going to come back to that. The Anglicization or the basically the settling of the Anglo settling of Texas, which was in dispute. It has a whole history of Mexico going back and forth, and that figures into the story. We're going to come back to that. And the Mexican-American War, which basically made what we call the American Southwest, which was before known as Mexico, part of the United States. So when you go out to California or places out there and you hear Spanish names and stuff like that, that's why. For those who speak Spanish, don't go to see something like, you see the word Los Gatos, say it's Las Gatas. Okay, you don't know. They don't, it's okay. So, people talk about people crossing the border, but what do you do when the border crosses you, right? These are old Spanish, families that had been in these places that were there well before these places were known as the United States. But anyway, so these are some of the things we have to think about. Doc was exactly right. The Civil War, of course, figures into this. It's a huge part of this, and it's the run up to that, especially in the 1850s, where this country, that compromise that I talked of earlier, is beginning to unravel. There's no way to keep the republic together. It would become, as Lincoln called it, a house divided, that cannot stand until this question of slavery was dealt with. And as we learn, this process just goes on. It's a great injustice to the people of Texas, enslaved of Texas and their ancestors, that this news was brought to them late, that this liberation, I said that it comes in, really liberates it with the Union Army, which they had done in the South. Remember, Reconstruction ends because of the withdrawal of Northern troops in the South, and another great compromise there. And so this system of compromise is the balance upon which all of this teeters. Used on the other way, like Dr. Shabazz was saying, Lincoln, writes an Emancipation Proclamation in 1862, in the months of 1862, which goes into effect January 1st, 1863. But it was essentially a military tactic because, as he was pointing out, it had no legal jurisdiction in the areas which were then in retaliation or who had withdrawn, that is to say, seceded from the Union. So in other words, he uses something that has no legal jurisdiction in a place where it has no legal jurisdiction, and where Lincoln did have legal jurisdiction, he chooses not to free those individuals. And that's what he was saying in the border states. who stayed loyal. They're border states because they stayed loyal to the Union, or they just stayed out of it. But essentially, that is important because the entire Civil War pivots and turns on the movement of Black people who hear about the Emancipation Proclamation. They hear about freedom. It's the reason why we have celebrated Emancipation Day, or it goes by many names, but many Black folk celebrate on January 1st and also on New Year's Eve, the eve before January 1st, sometimes in churches or wherever, because that watch night, watching for that word of jubilee, that word of freedom that's coming, is something that became, critically important. So,
Dr. Miletsky, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
You're in and out a little bit. Just want to let you know.
Okay, I think I'm done with my part then. Right now.
Okay.
I'm going to pass the baton back, as they say.
All right. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for providing all that context. I was not aware of all the moving parts that actually contributed to what would later become Juneteenth. So thank you for that knowledge drop. And I'm pretty sure our audience appreciates that as well, because that was the point of this program, to kind of shed a light on areas that most people might have not been familiar with. So we discussed the history of Juneteenth. And Dr. Miletsky, I'm going to lead with what you said. It goes by many names. What are some of the best ways for our viewers to learn more about Juneteenth and or how to celebrate Juneteenth? Then, Dr. Miletsky, I'll let you take this one first.
Okay. Some of the best ways to celebrate Juneteenth, you said.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that I'm finding, and talking to folks and stuff like that, and also noticing that a lot of people choose to celebrate Juneteenth through the lens of art, and creativity. That's a big part of what this is about. There's a lot of pain obviously associated with this topic, because anything having to do with slavery really does touch upon that, deal with that. But I think it's just a good day to be around family, if you can, and to celebrate family, because that's really what it's all about. In my case, I come from a racially mixed background. On my mother's side, her family is African American and Afro-Caribbean, got a little bit of both in there. And North Carolina, Jamaica, Barbados is all mixed in there a little bit, but mostly Northern North Carolina. And so, in doing like my genealogy and stuff, trying to figure all that out over the years, we're getting closer to finding the source in terms of our ancestors. And I think that that's a good thing to be thinking about on June. That's what I'll be doing. The theme for Black History Month this year was the Black family. After all, set up by the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. Call ourselves a SALA. And it's founded by Carter G. Woodson, who is thought of as the father of Black history, because he basically created Negro History Week,
Right.
26, which became Black History Month. So that's basically, I think what I'll be thinking about, and focusing on that creativity, the art, the artistic expression, because it has to be about healing. It has to be about healing and not forgetting what was taken. There's a lot of people who lost land. And then there's the 40 acres and a mule that was promised, and never really delivered upon. Just broken promises. And we have to stand in solidarity with those in Texas, because Texas had a really different kind of system there that was quite heavy, quite harsh in terms of how it dispatched its version of slavery and how it dealt with it. I don't think it's a total coincidence that the word came late. That's how we often tell the story. The word came late. Some people say, oh, a messenger was, there's all these myths around it. It's really more like Dr. Shabazz said, it was a fight because there was a resistance coming from Texas. And if you know the history of Texas, it begins to make a lot of sense why that might have been the case. It's a very, has its own unique history. One has been, is just as proud for African Americans from Texas. And remember, Texas has had Juneteenth as a state holiday since 1980.
Oh, wow, did not know that.
Yes, yeah, and it's something that has caught on, but they have been trying, much like what we see with Tulsa, 100 years of generations of people who were trying to say, we were done unjustly, our land was stolen from us, our businesses were taken from us, we were not remunerated for any of those efforts, and this thing called Black success became a threat that had to be eradicated, and it was. But where is the redress? Where is the reparation? And where is it's not just about payment, but it's about making whole a person who had something dear and taken from them. If you tell folks, you gotta try to make it in America, and people do just that, and they build Black banks, and they build Black, businesses, and they build Black, funeral homes and barbershops, luncheonettes, in order to try to make it, in the system for which they were, involuntary immigrants, to put it mildly. Some have called it. Didn't request to come here, And so, but it's Black folks' presence in America that has steered America on a better path to help it live up to its own stated beliefs. This is as Martin Luther King said, be true to what you put on paper.
All right. Well, thank you for that, and I feel like our viewers learned a lot in the breakdown you just provided, and I like how you tied it together to Tulsa, given that it's the 100th anniversary of Black Wall Street and what it symbolized to the African American community in terms of escaping slavery. I actually read there's a great book. It's called The First Black Millionaires, and they talk about the founder of Tulsa and how he wanted to create a space for African Americans to feel safe. And I recommend it to our readers if you want to learn more about what Dr. Miletsky was speaking about. But Dr. Shabazz, Dr. Shabazz, I would love to hear from your perspective for our audience, what are some of the best ways to learn more about Juneteenth and to celebrate it? So if you would, please.
Yeah, give thanks. Give thanks. Dr. Miletsky, he talked about the celebrating with art. Am I coming in okay?
Yeah, you're good.
You hear me
Yeah,
all right?
You're good.
You hear that?
Yep. We can hear that. Oh, the drums?
You hear that?
I see you drum, but I can't hear the drums. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, one of the ways that I'm usually celebrating Juneteenth is playing drums and gathering in the remembrance of African cultural identity. Yeah, for Juneteenth, for Kwanzaa, for Black Heritage Month, for Liberation Days, for Malcolm X's birthday, for any day that we can steal on the calendar to celebrate and inspire a remembrance, a memory of who we are. That's what Juneteenth was an attempt, or that's what the need of Juneteenth, and that's what the celebration of Juneteenth celebrates, was the attempt to deny us the truth, to deny us a memory, or the opportunity to remember who we are as not just some Johnny come lately Darwinistic evolved humans that were brought to civilization here in the Western Hemisphere. No, Juneteenth and any day that we can have an opportunity to remember and inspire our children to remember who we are as a captured African people that were brought here to this hemisphere. You're right. Yeah, there was no immigration and no Ellis Allen, and we came in the belly of ships, in the hold of ships. And where did we come from? We came from across the waters, and 50 to 100 million of us didn't even make it here. Now, when you tip your toe in Long Island Beach, excuse me, or any of those waters of this hemisphere, you know, you're putting your foot in a giant burial ground. At the bottom of that ocean are 50 to 100 million Africans that were tossed over in a sacrifice, in an unholy sacrifice, you know. And so any time that we can get a chance to inspire a remembrance of who we are and the social political circumstances that we still exist in. You know, we are captured people, and to be on the track of redeeming ourselves or repairing ourselves, yeah, it begins with an awakening of who we are, you know, and an awakening of the forces that surrounded us, that captured us, the forces that continue to make life difficult for us to achieve the fullness of our humanity. Yeah, man, this is a serious political time. And it's interesting because here in New York, I'm happy to learn. Look at lots of music. I'm happy to learn that, that I'm not the only one in this region that just came across this knowledge about Juneteenth. When I was coming up as a youth, I didn't know about Juneteenth. Juneteenth became a major celebration up in this region for me in the last 10, 15 years. But as I'm riding off it in the spirit of inspiration and what it's worth, that's what every holiday, that's what every opportunity that we can capture one another and talk on a higher level about where we are, where we've been, and where we need to go. The first place we need to go is beginning to love one another, brothers and sisters in the Black community first and foremost, and then beginning to embrace others. Thank you for being and organizing this council person, Mulé. Yeah, but yeah, Juneteenth is a celebration coming out of our community first. It's a celebration of what was denied us, and give thanks for others that want to celebrate and support our celebration, most definitely. But yeah, unity, and to know who we are uniting with in our own selves as Black people, not knowing our heritage and our contribution as not only the fathers and mothers of humanity, but the fathers and mothers of civilization, math, science, astronomy, architecture, you name the basic art of civilization, religion. All of these things start in the Nile Valley or originate in the heart of Africa before even the Nile Valley. And so this is the curriculum that is denied our children. This is the curriculum that if they were given, their humanity would be fully achieved like other cultures that have a well-shaped heritage from their origins to present time. And so Juneteenth, African Heritage Month, Kwanzaa, you name it, you know, get a Black history calendar and celebrate every day. Juneteenth gives us an opportunity to steal this time on Facebook, try to inspire parents to, yeah, what books can we celebrate? Well, in preparation for Juneteenth, like I said, Juneteenth is a new thing to me, but to try to deal a little bit of prepping for today's date was to really talk about the Civil War in the context of Juneteenth. I looked at this book by Vincent Harding. Vincent Harding, There Is a River. There is a River. Yeah, but some music is so strong in my neighborhood. I hope that's not picking up. There is a river. Then I also looked at another very important book by a very important scholar, Lerone Bennett, Before the Mayflower. Before the Mayflower. Africans, we were here before the Mayflower. We were here before Columbus. You know, another good book, you know, They Came Before Columbus by Ivan Van Sertima. That even gives a broader context of African heritage when Africans were traveling the hemisphere, the four corners of the globe, you know, the Olmec civilization influenced by the Nile Valley culture, 1200 BC. And so the four corners of the globe is, and as late as the 14th century in the Mali Empire, making contact with the Caribbean under the Mali Empire king of Abu Bakr II, the brother of Mansa Musa, who made his journey to the east in his Hajj. Mansa Musa made a journey to the Western Hemisphere 180 years before Columbus. Juneteenth gives us a chance to remember who we were before slavery, how we got through slavery, and it's through that memory that we'll get the inspiration to do what our ancestors will inspire us to do, to get through these times and to create this new world that we've been denied from knowing ourselves. That Juneteenth gives us a chance to once again celebrate and remember.
Dr. Shabazz, I'm not gonna lie to you, I am fired up after that response, man. You got me fired up and I want to learn some more.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Me too.
And I appreciate drumming
Yes,
that has
sir.
been so traditional within our culture. So thank you for that. And our audience appreciates that as well.
Respect.
So when Legislator Mulé puts a program together, she always likes to tie it together to our district and Long Island as a whole. So New York has always been a destination for those all around the world. But can you guys share some insight about possibly what abolitionist work looked like in New York, specifically on Long Island, if you have that kind of information?
Yeah. There's a lot to say about that. You know, and this is kind of like one of the things, you know, I hope you can hear me a little better.
Yep, you're good.
Clearly. Okay, thank you. You know, I'm gonna read something if that's all right.
Yeah, sure.
You know, because part of what this history is the fact that just by some historical circumstances, there were folks who were celebrating freedom and had been, you know, freed earlier in places like the North, the Northeast, places like New York, although it's later than a lot of the other states. But let me just read something here. You know, on January 1st, 1863, thousands of people gathered to await word of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation at Tremont Temple. This is in Boston, Massachusetts. Messengers were stationed through the city from the telegraph office, ready to bring word of Lincoln's decision as it came over the wire. Frederick Douglass described that historic day at Tremont Temple, saying, "The occasion, wherefore, was one of both hope and fear. Whether we should survive or perish depended in large measure upon the coming of this proclamation. We were waiting and listening as for a bolt from the sky, which should rend the fetters of our 4 millions of slaves. We were watching, as it were, by the dim lights of the stars, for the dawn of a new day. We were longing for the answer to the agonizing prayers of centuries." And so this is in Tremont Temple, which is a church in Boston, upon the Emancipation Proclamation. Vermont ends slavery in 1777. Massachusetts ends slavery a little bit after, and state by state in New England begins to end slavery. New York is one of the later states to end slavery. Not until 1827 was slavery finally abolished in the state of New York. And New York had a complicated relationship with the South, as probably you can imagine. You know, you have to understand the economic powerhouse that the cotton crop was for the growth of the United States. And remember, people used to talk about cotton is king, or you'd hear that, read that in history books and that kind of thing. one of the states that was the most involved in the trade in terms of cotton was the port of New York City and New York itself. You may know, we learned during the burial, there was a construction happening in Manhattan, Lower
Yep.
Manhattan, and near Wall Street, and it was, everything had to be stopped and halted immediately because the bodies of enslaved were found, and with just a little, not too much digging, shallow graves for the most part, and so essentially, it's been said before, but those slaves are the ones that built Wall Street, for which the wall is named after, and the street is named after, both figuratively and literally, right? It's the exploitation of their labor off the backs of the enslaved that makes the economic explosion of world capitalism basically possible, and so on and so forth. During the Civil War period, New York was on the verge of recognizing the Confederacy, and did actually pass a resolution in which they named themselves, sort of basically in support of, I think it was called the Empire State of the South, I forget exactly. And so this is all, documented pretty well because there's an economic, connection there. There was a lot of money to be made. It's not just cotton, it's the sail making, it's the wood and the timber for the ships, it's the insurance underwriting and policies that are written out of both Boston and New York companies that are still around today. It's the banks that insured the voyages. This is not just some kind of Gone with the Wind, sort of tragic sort of story that just comes out of nowhere. This is an economic piece that affects this region, and so these are some things I guess to think about. There was slavery in New York, as I was saying, and in Long Island, and there's a important history to be told. I have a book here that I could show. I have a lot of books here. Making a Way to Freedom, A History of African Americans on Long Island by Linda R. Day, Professor Day, our colleague, Brother Shabazz, myself, I know he knows Dr. Day, and she's at Brooklyn College. And, this book, she talks about some of the celebrations, that took place that were, specific to Long Island, celebrations that go back to, even during slavery. But what you have is basically a long march toward freedom. Remember that even the Amistad ship, in which there was a overthrow of the and taking over of the ship by Cinque, who was an African chief. When you go and just take a whole bunch of people out of a place, you never know who you're getting. You might just mess around and get a son of an African chief who has the wherewithal and the ability to muster up, people to fight for freedom. They take over the ship and it wanders into Long Island Sound till being sent back to New Haven. And that whole case, if anybody saw that movie Amistad, that was based on that. Now that's the name of the slave ship, Amistad. And if anybody who I know speaks Spanish is listening knows the word Amistad, it means friendship. What kind of name is that for a ship that's carrying terror, disease, the end of life, people chained and so forth, can't, move, and, chained in such a way to make sure that they were never next to someone who spoke the same language, on a ship called Amistad. And so we got to start asking ourselves, like, what does that do? Why name a ship that? Does that help the person who is underwriting, the policy at Prudential, whatever, who makes the shackles? Who builds the chains? draftsman. He might have nothing to do with slavery, and he goes home and feels fine. But if you have designed something that is, you ever see all these elaborate instruments that keep people from running away? These terrible medieval kind of, this is America. This happened in America. It happened in Long Island. It happened in Boston, Massachusetts. It happened in the North. It's the reason why New York is the place that a lot of people are proud to be part of. My dad is from New York, and my grandfather's from Harlem, and we, but we have to face the legacy of, what provided the wealth to be able to build a Long Island, or to build a Wall Street, or to build, New York. And if that is the case, then when are we going to, sort of do the right thing, as Spike Lee would say, and just really, that's what this, and I want to thank you all too for having me. That's what this event is about, is asking people to consider that, if you give, one group an incredible head start, and then, throw someone in the race, like in the middle, who's like kind of hobbling, barely able to even run, never mind, a win, and then turn around and blame those very same people for not wanting to work, or not wanting to win, not wanting to, do things that people consider to be like what Americans should be doing. That is a thing that we have to stop doing, that people have to stop, that the blaming thing, history precedes us, it happened before we got here. But if we don't do anything to change it while we're here, then it will just continue to go on. And so that's what Juneteenth is. It's a chance. This may become a national holiday. If it becomes a national holiday, the post office will be closed. Other things will be closed. People will get holiday pay. If you're in New York State, you do get holiday pay because it's a state holiday now. And that's important. Those things are important. Give people a chance to reflect, rest, and start to, show that people do really care.
As we've been here, a notification came up on my phone that the Senate just passed making Juneteenth a national holiday.
Wow. Look.
Yeah. So of course we know it has to go through the full process, but that's great news.
Wow.
It's amazing.
Yeah. Thank you, Legislator Millet, for delivering that great news. Oh my God. Wow.
We can't take credit for this, but I feel this is,
Can you repeat
Oh,
that?
wow.
I didn't hear what you said. Can you repeat it?
Yeah, so the Senate, as we were talking just now, the Senate has approved to make Juneteenth a national holiday. The United States Senate. Yeah.
Positive.
Yeah.
All right. African applause. African applause. Beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
So I think that, every little thing, and I know that what we're doing here today, what we did, Jonathan and I together did as the office of the legislature, we just provided an opportunity to have this conversation, and it's just one small piece of what hopefully are many, many discussions like this. And the more we can get out the information, and the more people can learn, myself included, I'm learning so much tonight. I think that can only be a good thing for society.
Yeah. Yeah. And actually, Legislator Millet, thank you again for that historic news, and to our audience for sharing that historic moment with us during our Juneteenth celebration. So, as distinctive scholars in your field, I have to ask, what have been your experiences when educating tomorrow's leaders in your respected fields? Essentially, all the knowledge you guys do possess, and sharing that with the next generation to ensure, this knowledge is not forgotten, and it's preserved, and it's shared. So, Dr. Shabazz, I'm going to start with you on that one, if you'd be so kind.
Well, give thanks. You know, most of my professional career, I've said that I've kind of infiltrated the English department to bring Africana studies or Black studies, and that's really what I've done. Some students have called my English classes Black Panther courses, but yeah, man, my courses have really only been designed to pull the cloak off of some untold aspects of American history and heritage, you know, and yeah, to not only highlight the the slighted experience of enslaved Africans who were brought here, but also, you know, to recognize a kinship relationship, you know, that African people have always had with the indigenous people, the so-called Native Americans, American Indians, Turtle Islanders, that many of an African American, you know, has much of that indigenous, quote unquote, Native American blood within our lineage, and yeah, that there is this kinship, this kindred kinship that, you know, I talked about Africans that were here before Columbus. And so, yeah, in truth, that kinship had begun before Westerners or Europeans arrived here. And in this whole spirit of awakening and in my curriculum, you know, that is really what my curriculum is designed to do, is to really try to yeah, bring an enlightenment to the missing pages of American heritage. And trust me, there are many missing pages. There are many missing stories. And so, yeah, to also my work to as teaching this next generation, and I don't know how much avail I've had or how much success I've had in that, but it's to really try to inspire young students to become teachers. You know, that there is a dearth of educators, I think, across the country, but most definitely in the Black community, and I believe even the Brown community as well. And so, you know, yeah, I enjoy the art and the profession of teaching, and it can be an honest profession. And yeah, we need some young, motivated teachers in the ranks to research and write and explore and reveal and share, you know, this information, so that, you know, generations that will come forward in the future, you know, may be able to create a better world with right knowledge. You can't produce a better world, you know, with the same old imperfect knowledge. We have to perfect knowledge and yeah, man, bring the fullness of the truth. You know, Dr. King, one of his famous quotes was that the arc of the universe, you know, turns toward justice, and you know, African people in the Nile Valley, they have the oldest deciphered literary record. That's the oldest writing that humans have, is what they call hieroglyphics. And out of that hieroglyphics came the astronomy as well as the astrology. And in the astrology, they said that, yeah, we have moved into the age of Aquarius, And so, yeah, the age of Aquarius, about celestial waters, you know, bringing enlightenment to the humanity that's on the planet. And so, yeah, man, give thanks that, yeah, all of us that are here in the spirit of the age of Aquarius. In the 60s, the Fifth Dimension, they sang a song. They said, this is the dawning of the age. This is 2021, 6251, according to the ancient Egyptian calendar. All right, but yeah, we are in it. The age of Aquarius, 2,000 more years. And give thanks that we have lived to see it and be part of it. And yeah, it's all based upon enlightenment and truth and aligning one's heart to that which is truth, you know. And it's not about skin or color, or racial or ethnic identity. It's about aligning one's heart to the principles of truth, justice, righteousness.
All
Yes,
right.
Ma'at is what they called it in the ancient Nile Valley. And presently I've become the chair of the Africana Studies Department at Nassau Community College, and no longer infiltrating, but really standing in the right place in the discipline. And the foundation of all human studies is the oldest deciphered literary tradition, which again is the hieroglyphics. In hieroglyphics, they talked about Ma'at. Ma'at is the basis for the 10 Commandments, and it's the same mission that the Africans who on the plantations had, to try to raise the moral bar for humanity from antiquity to the teachers of the Greeks and the Romans who invaded the Nile Valley and drank well from the art of civilization there, to the Moors that conquered Europe for 800 years and had the first universities built in Europe, challenging the Catholic Church that was trying to keep the masses of people in Europe in the state of serfdom. But yet, yeah, man, it's the same mission that the African humanity has. It's to try to, as Dr. King shared, guide with the moral arc that's based on knowledge and truth, justice, and righteousness. That's the mission. Give thanks for the opportunity to share. If you come by and want to take a course in Africana Studies at Nassau Community College, yeah, man, I think it's open admission. And yeah, you can just take a course, even you can even, I think if you're a senior citizen, you may be even able to audit, of course. I had some auditors in some of my courses last semester. Give thanks for the opportunity to share.
All right. Well, it's been about 5 years since I sat through a college course, but after this program, I might have to look into enrolling at Nassau for this course. Dr. Miletsky, if you'd be so kind to take us home with your thoughts and what your experience have been in shaping our leaders of tomorrow in your respective field, if you'd be so kind.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, once again, I just want to congratulate my colleague and my brother, who's who's someone who has been working for a long time, long before I came to Long Island, I'll tell you that much. And whose reputation is known throughout the island and other places. The work, what he described, and the if you like what you were hearing there, then you will like Africana Studies. You will like something that people call Black Studies and African American Studies, because that is, that's the kind of stuff that we have the pleasure, and I have had the honor and pleasure of being able to teach about as well at Stony Brook. He really kind of like told it to us right, because if we know that humanity begins in Africa, and that has been pretty much established, I believe, by science. And interestingly enough, this business, if you ever take a geology course, you may have learned about something called Olduvai Gorge. Olduvai Gorge in Kenya was another famous dig. And this is really basically where this was proven, that humanity began in Africa. Lucy, the earliest human, and so on and so forth, that goes on. And so the point is, if that's the case, then it makes sense that all of the things that humans do, like writing, language, knowledge of self, and knowledge of languages, books, all that stuff, would start there. Right? That's the reason why Timbuktu is one of the grandest, most well-respected libraries throughout the history of the ancient world. It was the place where other societies that developed after Africa, where humanity didn't start, right? Other places, and that migration out of Africa, which is also pretty well documented, into these other places, they continue to come back to the font of knowledge, wisdom, and civilization of the Nile Valley, as he was talking about. There's a lot of clues to this. There's a lot of Black folks that pop up, in Western, what we consider so-called Western art or Western civilization. depicted as saints. Black images, the black image in art is an important thing. I remember I was listening to NPR one day, and they were saying that in the Spanish language, the expression, again, to go back to Spanish, is something in Spain, that is, no hay moros en la costa, which basically means the coast is clear, right? It means, like, it's just a colloquialism, something, an expression people say. You mean to say, like, everything good, no hay moros en la costa. But it means there are no Moors on the coastline. Right?
Yeah.
Rocket, right? So you see, no, that's ingrained in the language. You look at a map and you look at how close southern Spain is to northern Africa. It starts to make complete sense. As my brother said, ruled for 800 years by under Moorish rule in Spain, right? And so but the point is that
pulled Europe out of the Dark Ages, if I could just say that. They pulled Europe out of the Dark Ages. Europe was in the Dark Ages when the Moors came, and they experienced the Renaissance, the opening up of universities, the spreading of knowledge. Yeah, what an enlightenment to study in the legacy of the Moors, and much of Spanish culture and Spanish heritage and Spanish identity in 800 years. You'd have to also recognize that African influence, Spanish architecture, Spanish music, Spanish medicine. Oh, yeah, so much.
Yeah. So it's our history is more complicated than we like to pretend to be, but the clues are there for us. Go to Egypt and look at the Sphinx. No one can set eyes on the way the Sphinx was supposed to look, which is, patterned after African features, beautiful African nose, African features, because the nose has been cut off, has been taken off. Look at the distortion over the years, and yet you have an African symbol on something that we all probably have in our pocket right now, which is the dollar bill. It's called the pyramid. And so the thing is, and go to Washington, D.C., and I know Doc was going there in terms of, our guide, yeah. But the monument, the national monument, right? It's an obelisk. So America knows from whence it comes, and Western civilization understands from whence their tradition comes. I loved Gandhi's line. A reporter asked Gandhi one time, "What do you think about Western civilization?" He said, "I think it would be a great idea." So it's a stolen legacy only because one comes before the other. It's that simple. If you learn in history, there's a timeline. Well, Africa's timeline is year zero. You see, so that's the beginning. And so that there's people say, what are you talking about when we were kings and Africa had kingdoms and stuff? It's just so far before what we've learned about, which is considered more recent history in the world, on the world, arc. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice for those whose legacy is trying to be replaced. And people have, unfortunately, one of the consequences of the kind of like this thing that explodes out of Spain in 1492, ending that 800-year reign, an expansionism and an enthusiasm and an exuberance, which has like a whole bunch of reasons behind it, comes out as an imperialistic kind of thing and ready to conquer something. That's unfortunate. That was very unfortunate, to put it mildly, because if you are out to do that, then you must convince those who come from the original civilization that they have contributed nothing, that their people never did anything, that you never invented anything. You can't drive from one part of Long Island to the other without experiencing at least 5 Black inventions that Black men and women hold patents for. Okay, so there's been an attempt, a successful one in some ways, to erase the legacy and contributions of Black people, the original people, even the idea that that civilization in Africa started in Africa itself has been attempted to be wiped out, the Sphinx. And so history is no mystery, as they say, the clues are there. use your instincts and trust your teachers, great professors like Dr. Shabazz and others, and those of us who are working, Dr. Georgia Greer Key and other folks who are working in Black studies and Africana studies. This is what we do in class. You got a sample of it. It's anti-racist teaching. It's helping people to deconstruct things that they don't understand or know about. They want to help. I have white students in class who sit there and they're quiet and they say like, this isn't about me. And then but then I teach them like in the beginning of the 20th century, the Irish weren't even considered white. If you were Italian, you weren't really considered completely white. There was discrimination against those groups. There was discrimination against Catholics. I remind them of that movie Gangs of New York. You had the nativists and the know-nothings, newspapers which are depicting Irish with ape-like features, not Black people, Irish. Remember when John F. Kennedy was running for president, people were really oh my goodness, an Irish Catholic for president. They used to call them papists. See, there's a legacy of discrimination against people who are so-called white that goes back a long way. And then they realize, I am part of this. I ask the students sometimes, close your eyes and tell me what you see when I say all-American. And the answer is always the same. Blue eye, blonde hair, and yet who's more American than Black Americans? Who's more American than Native Americans? As Dr. Shabazz was saying, and yet we don't think of those things. When we say words like mainstream, or when we say inner city, or when we say urban, we all know what that means, all the code words and stuff like that. So sometimes what my students do, especially, the Black students, and also the white students, is deconstructing that whole thing. They're saying, this happened before me, I disavow it, and I don't want any part of that. Last thing I'll say, Tom Hanks had a thing he was saying recently in a tweet. He said, why didn't I learn any of this stuff in school? How come I never heard about Tulsa? It's proof that people want to hear, like Dr. Shabazz said, the incomplete parts, what's missing out of the American story. You can't understand the Civil War without understanding the Black presence there. You can't understand the foundation of housing in America without understanding discrimination and racism. We can't understand how Long Island is set up. Now, we didn't have any fault in that necessarily, but if we don't make ourselves part of the solution, then we're just part of the problem. We have to do that work, and it starts in classrooms like that.
Wow. Gentlemen, I cannot thank you enough for the knowledge that was dropped on this platform, not only with myself, but our Facebook viewers and with Legislator Mulé. The way, Dr. Miletsky, the way you just tied that together and kind of talked about, the history of everyone has experienced some form of discrimination, and how, we all share that within our history, to kind of work towards more inclusive society is just well done. You mentioned the greats that are doing this work, and please include yourself in that as well. Because that was very profound. Gentlemen, I cannot thank you enough. I'm going to turn it out now to Legislator Mulé to close out our program for the evening. Thank you again, gentlemen. And Legislator.
May I ask, how's our audience? Do we have a big audience?
We did. I'm watching. I'll be able to give everybody the final numbers once we wrap up on Zoom, because it's shifting. So I apologize. But I'll be more than happy to update you guys with that later this evening. Legislator Mulé.
Just to add on to that, a lot of times people watch this after it's been on live, because it's recorded and people can watch it anytime they want at their convenience. So the numbers get even bigger at that point. Yeah. But I too would like to give my thanks to Dr. Miletsky and Dr. Shabazz for this extremely informative forum that you've provided. You've given us all a lot to think about, and I hope to continue on my journey of learning. I'm sure that many other people are feeling inspired to do that as well. And finally, I want to give thanks to my Chief of Staff, Jonathan, for putting this together. And this could not have happened without him. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Jonathan.
All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending tonight's program, our Juneteenth celebration. There, due to the week. Oh, yes, Dr. Shabazz, please.
I was wondering if I could try to stay in touch with potential audience that we have by sharing my
Sure.
website.
Please, please.
Yeah, I have a website. It's blacktotheroots.net. Not back, but black, BLACKTOTHEROOTS.net. Blacktotheroots.net. Much thanks.
All right.
Jonathan, perhaps we can put that in the post
Yep.
somewhere.
I'll
Yep.
I'll edit it. I'll include that in the
Okay, great.
To our Facebook audience, to our panelists, Legislator Mulé, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much. As I was saying, Nassau County will be hosting several Juneteenth events this week, as well as your local library. So if you do want to learn more, please feel free to check those out. I know one of our panelists, Dr. Miletsky, will be doing something with Uniondale Public Library tomorrow. So I will be tuning in for that. And for all the updates, check out our social media. Everyone take care and have a good night.
Have a good night.